If you love timeless tales of love, regret, and second chances, make sure to subscribe and leave a comment below. Tell me, do you believe that love can wait 10 years and still remain unchanged? England, in the spring of 1810, carried a kind of beauty that often felt cruel to those who longed for something just beyond reach. The sun shone gently over the Greystone estate, glimmering on marble columns and rose bushes heavy with bloom. Inside, the great hall echoed with the laughter of guests who had gathered for yet another dinner in honor of a daughter soon to be engaged. But not for Lady Helena Greystone. Helena stood near the tall windows, her reflection caught between the glass and the setting light. She was 26 years old, the last unmarried daughter of Baron Greystone. Her elder sisters were long since wed to respectable men, their children already running through the gardens. Helena, though admired for her poise and quiet intelligence, had reached the age where society's pity began to outweigh its curiosity. She was a gentle presence, too thoughtful, perhaps, for a world that valued charm over sincerity. Behind her, footsteps approached. She knew them before turning. Thomas Ashford, the young captain who had been a frequent guest since his return from service in Spain. His uniform carried the faint scent of travel, his dark eyes steady, his manner both proud and restrained. He was not a man of title, but he bore something rarer honor, unpolished by wealth. "Lady Helena," he said softly, "you seem far away tonight." "Only thinking," she replied. "That is often my trouble." He smiled faintly. "Then I would give you something else to think about." She turned then, and the look on his face stilled her breath. He drew a small box from his coat. No audience, no announcement, only the quiet courage of a man who had already decided his heart's course. "I came here," he said, "because I cannot imagine the rest of my life without you in it. Helena, I have no estate to offer, no fortune beyond my commission, but I can promise you devotion that will not fade when the seasons change." For a long moment, silence filled the space between them. The candles flickered, the distant music softened. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, the promise of a life simple but true, and yet, beneath her calm, she felt the weight of her father's voice, stern, unyielding. "Remember, Helena," he had said not long ago, "our family cannot afford sentiment. You must marry well. The Greystone fortune is not what it was." Her heart ached as she looked at Thomas. "You deserve more than what I can give," she whispered. He shook his head. "All I want is your word. Then I must disappoint you." "Calm." The words came out like a knife. She saw his face pale, though his voice remained steady. "Is that your answer?" "It must be," she said, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "My family expects—" "I understand," he interrupted quietly. "You would not risk their displeasure." "It is not only that," she said, though even to her ears it sounded hollow. "It is everything. The world we live in does not forgive love without position." Thomas nodded slowly, the lines around his mouth tightening. "Then I will not trouble you again. But know this, Helena, when I leave England, I will carry only one regret, that I asked too late." He closed the small box without opening it, placed it on the table beside her, and turned away. She wanted to call after him, to take back the words, but pride held her still. Through the window she watched him cross the courtyard, his figure outlined by moonlight. He paused once, as if listening for her voice. Then he was gone. When she finally opened the box, the ring inside was simple, a modest band of gold, unadorned, perfect in its honesty. Her vision blurred. She pressed the ring to her chest, whispering, "I would have said yes, if the world were kinder." That night, rain began to fall. The sound of it against the windows carried through the house, mingling with the faint echo of her sister's laughter from distant rooms. Helena sat alone, the unopened letter she would never send resting on the desk beside her. She wrote his name once more, Captain Thomas Ashford, and stared at it until the ink bled. Weeks later, news came that his regiment had marched again toward France. By autumn, a letter arrived not from him but from his commanding officer. Thomas Ashford had been gravely wounded and was missing after battle. No body had been found. Helena read the letter 3 times before folding it carefully and locking it away with the ring he had left behind. She told no one, not her father, not her sisters. The world went on as if nothing had changed, but for her, every season since had carried the sound of rain on glass. She would never marry. That, she decided, would be her quiet vow. For 10 years, she kept it, and in that vow, her story began. 10 years can change the shape of everything except memory. England, in the late autumn of 1820, lay beneath a sky the color of pewter. The fields had turned to pale gold, and the hedgerows were stripped bare by the wind. At Greystone Cottage, a modest house near the edge of Wiltshire, Lady Helena Greystone sat by the window, embroidering in the fading light. The fire burned low, casting shadows that trembled across the worn carpet. Her aunt, Mrs. Evelyn Harcourt, dozed in the armchair beside her, a novel resting half open in her lap. The clock upon the mantel ticked gently, measuring the stillness that had become Helena's daily companion. 10 years of quiet days and careful composure had softened her once bright features, yet there was a beauty in her restraint, something calm and enduring, like porcelain shaped by fire. She was no longer the daughter of privilege. Her father had long since passed, her sisters were scattered in fine houses across England, and Helena herself lived on a modest allowance that permitted dignity, but not extravagance. The world now called her the Greystone Spinster, though in the village nearby she was known more kindly as Miss Helena, a lady of gentle manners and generous heart. Her life had narrowed to simple routines: reading, writing letters, tending the garden, helping the local vicar's school. It was enough, or at least it had been until the morning the post arrived bearing a letter sealed with black wax. The handwriting upon the envelope was unfamiliar, firm and elegant. Helena hesitated before breaking the seal. The letter within was brief, written in a style she had not seen in many years. "My dear Lady Helena, it has been a long road, but I have at last returned to England. My duties are many, yet there remains one matter I cannot leave unsettled. If you will permit it, I shall call upon you within the fortnight. Yours faithfully, Thomas Ashford, Duke of Ravensfield." Her hand trembled. She read the signature again, scarcely believing her eyes. Duke of Ravensfield. For a moment, she thought it a mistake, some cruel jest. Thomas Ashford, the soldier who had once stood before her with an unadorned ring, had not been born to a title. Yet the truth unfolded swiftly in the following days, carried on the currents of gossip that even Wiltshire could not escape. The former Duke of Ravensfield had died without direct heir. His distant cousin, none other than Captain Thomas Ashford, had inherited the title and estates by a twist of fate that society called remarkable and Providence, perhaps called inevitable. Helena folded the letter carefully and pressed it against her lips, unsure whether she prayed or merely trembled. He was alive. Not only alive, but powerful, respected, admired. And she was a woman whom the world had quietly forgotten. For several days she avoided speaking of it. Her aunt, half-blind and wholly absorbed in novels, noticed nothing, yet Helena could not still the unease within her. She imagined his face as it must be now older, sterner, perhaps touched with bitterness. 10 years could not have passed gently for a man who had known war. She remembered how he had looked that last night standing in moonlight, his voice calm even as her words cut him. "When I leave England, I will carry only one regret." Her throat tightened. That regret now stood upon English soil again. 2 weeks passed before another letter arrived, written in the same hand. "Lady Helena, I shall be in your county on business this Thursday. If it does not offend, I would pay my respects at Greystone Cottage at noon. I will not intrude should you prefer otherwise. A single word of reply will suffice. Yours, Ravensfield." She set the letter down, her pulse unsteady. To see him again after 10 years, how could she bear it? And yet, how could she refuse? To deny him now would be cowardice unworthy of the woman she had become. That evening she wrote a short reply. "Your Grace, you will be welcome at noon. Helena Greystone." When Thursday came, frost had settled upon the ground. The air was sharp, the sun weak but clear. Helena wore a gown of dark green wool, simple yet elegant, her hair pinned neatly beneath a modest cap. She stood by the hearth, pretending calm as the clock struck 12. The sound of carriage wheels broke the stillness. Moments later, the butler, an old servant who had followed her from her father's house, announced gravely, "His Grace, the Duke of Ravensfield." Helena turned. He stood in the doorway, taller than she remembered, his presence commanding but not proud. Time had carved strength into his features, yet his eyes were the same dark, steady, filled with quiet intensity. "Lady Helena," he said, inclining his head, "it has been far too long." She managed a faint smile. 10 years, Your Grace. A lifetime, it seems." He stepped forward, his voice low. 10 years, and yet I find I have not forgotten a single word we ever spoke. Her breath caught. "Then you remember I once refused you?" "Yes," he said, his expression unreadable. "And I have returned to ask why." The fire crackled between them. Outside, the winter wind whispered through the bare trees. In that stillness, surrounded by echoes of what had been lost, Helena realized that the past was not a ghost, After all, it had simply been waiting for the right hour to knock upon her door. The morning after his arrival, the air in Wiltshire carried the sharp scent of frost and wood smoke. The visit of a duke was no small matter for such a quiet village, and word spread quickly that the Duchess's carriage had been seen upon the old road to Greystone Cottage. Servants whispered, neighbours speculated, and even the vicar's wife pretended an errand that allowed her to walk past the gates. Helena, unaware of the stir, sat in her drawing-room waiting for Thomas to return from his meeting with the local magistrate. He had promised to call again before leaving for London, only to pay his respects, as he had said. Yet those few words lingered like perfume, half gentle, half dangerous. Her aunt, Mrs. Harcourt, insisted upon rearranging every vase of flowers in the room. "It would not do," she said firmly, "for a duke to see us unprepared, even if he was once merely a captain." Quote. Helena smiled faintly but said nothing. She could not explain to her aunt that no arrangement of roses could soften the weight of 10 years. At precisely noon, the sound of wheels crunched over gravel. Through the window, Helena saw his carriage halt before the gate. The driver leapt down, opened the door, and Thomas Ashford, the Duke of Ravensfield, stepped out. The sight of him struck her like a memory given flesh. He wore a dark coat trimmed in gold, his bearing composed but unforced. There was power in his stillness, the quiet confidence of a man who no longer needed to seek approval. Yet when he saw her at the door, something human, almost tender, passed across his face. "Lady Helena," he greeted, bowing slightly, "I am grateful you allowed me to call again." "You are welcome, Your Grace." Her voice was calm, though her heart beat wildly. He glanced around the modest drawing-room as he entered. "You have made a beautiful home here. Go." "It is small," she said, "but it suits me. The world has grown too large to chase." He smiled faintly. "I know that feeling better than you might think." For a moment, they stood in silence. The fire crackled softly. The clock ticked. Time seemed to bend between them, not forward or back, but into a single trembling line. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "When last we met, I spoke cruelly. I did not mean to wound." He studied her face. "And yet you did. I carried those words through every battlefield I crossed." Her gaze faltered. "You must think me selfish." "I think you honest," he said, "perhaps too honest for the world that shaped you." She turned toward the window, unable to bear the gravity of his tone. Outside, the garden lay still, a thin layer of frost turning the bare branches silver. "You wrote that you came to settle an old matter. Does it still trouble you so much?" "It troubles me because it never ended," he replied. 10 years ago, I left this country with a promise unspoken. I meant to return with something worthy of you: wealth, title, name. But when I came back, I found I had gained everything except peace." She turned to him then. "And you think peace lies in confronting the past?" He stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. "I think peace lies in understanding it." The words hung between them, heavy yet kind. Helena felt a strange calm settle within her, though her heart raced beneath it. "Then ask what you came to ask," she said. "Very well." His voice softened. "Why did you refuse me?" Her breath caught. The question she had rehearsed answering in her mind for 10 years now stood before her like judgment. "You know why," she said weakly. "I know what your father wished. I know what society demanded. But I do not know what you felt." She hesitated, her eyes filling with tears she had not expected. "I was afraid," she whispered. "Not of poverty, but of happiness that might not last. You were so certain, and you doubted me," he said quietly. "I doubted the world," she corrected. "And perhaps myself. You were everything I could have loved too much." Thomas's expression did not change, yet something in his shoulders eased, as if he had been waiting for those words. "That," he said softly, "is the cruelest kind of compliment." She smiled through her tears. "I have had 10 years to make it sound less foolish. I failed." He looked down, then back at her. "You have not changed, Helena." "Neither have you," she said. "You still speak as if truth were a kindness." He gave a low laugh, more breath than sound. "Perhaps I have learned that truth at least endures when everything else fades." The door opened then, and Mrs. Harcourt entered, her manner flustered but polite. "Your Grace, tea is served. I do hope you take sugar. We have only brown." Thomas turned to her with gracious ease. "Brown will do perfectly, madam. It is finer than what I had in the field." The old lady beamed, oblivious to the tension that filled the room. Helena poured the tea herself, her hands steady though she could scarcely taste what she drank. Conversation turned to harmless topics: the weather, the state of the roads, the improvements at Ravensfield. Yet beneath the civility, every word carried an echo of what remained unsaid. When he rose to leave, the hour had deepened into afternoon. "I am returning to London tomorrow," he said. "There are matters awaiting me there. But if I may—" He paused, his eyes meeting hers. "There is a winter ball at Ravensfield next month. I would be honored if you would attend." She hesitated. "After all these years?" He inclined his head. "Perhaps 10 years is long enough for silence. Come, if only to prove that time has not taken everything." She could not refuse him, not again. "If my aunt's health allows, I will consider it," she said. "Then I will hope for her excellent recovery," he replied. When he was gone, the house seemed larger and emptier all at once. Helena stood at the window as the carriage rolled away, its wheels stirring the last of the frost. The tea had gone cold upon the table, the fire burned low. She touched her hand to her heart and whispered, "Perhaps it is time to stop living among ghosts." Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall. The first snow of winter melted quickly in Wiltshire, leaving behind the damp smell of earth and the pale gleam of bare branches. Days passed in quiet rhythm, yet within Helena, the calm she had cultivated for 10 years no longer held. The visit from Thomas had awakened something she thought long buried, a restlessness that whispered each night when the fire dimmed. She told herself she would not think of him, but thought, once invited, cannot be dismissed so easily. Each time she looked toward the small writing desk by the window, her eyes fell upon the letter he had left behind, folded neatly with her reply unopened beside it. Mrs. Harcourt, oblivious to the quiet turmoil, spent her mornings planning menus and her evenings discussing ailments, blissfully unaware that her niece's heart had become a battlefield of its own. It was on a dull grey morning in early January, when another letter arrived, bearing the crest of Ravensfield. Helena recognized the seal before the butler announced it. Her fingers trembled slightly as she broke the wax. "My dear Lady Helena, the winter ball at Ravensfield shall be held on the 15th of February. The occasion is simple, intended to mark the season and the reopening of the estate. I would be most honored if you would attend as my guest. The invitation extends also to Mrs. Harcourt, whose company I recall with affection. Yours ever faithfully, Ravensfield." She read the letter twice, then placed it upon the mantel, pretending to study the fire. "Another invitation?" asked Mrs. Harcourt, peering over her spectacles. Helena hesitated. "From His Grace. He invites us both to Ravensfield next month." Her aunt's eyes brightened at once. "A duke's invitation, my dear, is not one to be refused. And after such a kind visit, how could we deny him?" "It is not so simple," Helena said softly. "Nonsense. You have been hidden here too long. London will open its doors to Ravensfield's Duchess, whoever she may one day be. Besides, you have a gown that would do perfectly for the occasion." Helena smiled faintly. "That gown is 10 years old. Then it is practically new. Fashion is a circle. All that was once elegant becomes so again." There was no winning against her aunt's enthusiasm. And perhaps, Helena thought, there was no point in resisting what fate had already decided. When the day came, the journey to London was long but uneventful. The city greeted them in its usual fashion, grey skies, clattering wheels, and the faint scent of coal smoke that seemed to cling to everything. They took rooms in a small but respectable lodging house near Grosvenor Square. From her window, Helena could see the steady rhythm of life returning to the streets after Christmas. Carriages rolled past, ladies hurried between visits, and children chased one another through the slush. Somewhere in that world, she thought, Thomas moved as easily as breath itself. A week later, a formal card arrived from Ravensfield's London townhouse, confirming their carriage arrangements for the ball. The script was precise and elegant. Her heart stirred as she read the final line. "It will be good to see you among the light again." The night of the ball came at last. The sky was clear, the stars bright against the frost. The carriage that arrived to fetch them was drawn by 2 black horses, the Ravensfield crest glimmering faintly upon the door. Mrs. Harcourt, wrapped in her finest shawl, chattered with excitement. "How fortunate we are, my dear. Few ladies can boast of such company." Helena smiled, though her thoughts were far from vanity. As the carriage approached the grand house on St. James's Street, her heart began to quicken. The windows blazed with light, music floated into the night air. Footmen lined the steps, their livery gleaming. Inside, the great hall was transformed into a vision of gold and crystal. Chandeliers cast soft brilliance upon polished marble. The air hummed with the murmur of voices and the sweep of gowns. And there, near the base of the staircase, stood Thomas. He was dressed in black and white, a simple combination that somehow made him the most striking figure in the room. When he saw her, his expression changed, nothing dramatic, only a subtle softening, as if the crowd around them had vanished. "Lady Helena," he said when she reached him, bowing slightly, "I was beginning to fear you would not come." "I was beginning to fear the same," she replied. He offered his arm. "Will you allow me the first dance?" Her answer was a whisper, "Yes." The music began a waltz, slow and lilting. He guided her onto the floor with steady grace. The world blurred. She could feel the warmth of his hand through her glove, the measured rhythm of his steps, the scent of faint cedar upon his coat. 10 years disappeared, not with words but with movement. They did not speak for some time. Then he said quietly, "I see you kept your promise." "Me promise." "To remain exactly as you are." She looked up at him, startled. "You once told me the same." "Then perhaps we have both succeeded," he said with a faint smile. Around them, the room glowed with the easy luxury of those who had never known longing. Yet within their orbit, there was only the pulse of old emotion reawakened. When the music ended, he released her hand but did not step away. "You are exactly as I remembered," he murmured. "And you," she said softly, "are not at all as I imagined." For a heartbeat, they simply looked at one another. Then applause broke the spell, and he offered his arm once more. "Come, there is something I would show you." He led her through the open doors to a smaller salon, quieter, where the light was gentler. Upon a table lay a single white rose, preserved beneath glass. "Do you remember this?" he asked. She frowned slightly. "A rose?" "The last one from your father's garden, the day I left for war. You gave it to me. I kept it still." Her voice trembled. "After all this time?" "Some things," he said, "survive even without tending." "Aye." Before she could answer, a guest entered, calling for the Duke's attention. Thomas turned briefly, excused himself, and left her there with the rose and the memory of 10 years compressed into a single glance. When she returned to her aunt, the music had resumed. Yet for Helena, the night no longer belonged to London. It belonged to a single quiet room and the scent of a rose that had not faded. The music swelled again in the ballroom, carrying with it the hum of laughter, silk, and whispered envy. Helena stood near the edge of the floor, the noise surrounding her like a distant sea. She could still feel the ghost of Thomas's hand against her glove, the steady rhythm that had guided her through the waltz. The candlelight shimmered upon crystal and glass, and she watched as he moved among his guests, speaking with calm grace, smiling occasionally but never truly at ease. There was a gravity in him now that had not existed before, a shadow born of command, of years spent surviving things the world would never ask about. Mrs. Harcourt had found a chair near the refreshment table and was delighting in conversation with a kindly colonel's wife. Helena, left momentarily to herself, turned toward the open doors of the side salon where the white rose still lay beneath glass. The sight of it had unsettled her. That a man could keep such a fragile token for 10 years seemed both impossible and profoundly kind. "Lady Helena." She turned. Thomas stood at the doorway, the crowd behind him dissolving into light and movement. "You left before the second set," he said softly. "Have I driven you to seek refuge already?" She smiled faintly. "Not refuge. Reflection." "Then I hope you found it." "I found more than I expected," she answered. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Do you know, when I left that day 10 years ago, I thought I would forget the way you looked in that garden, the color of your gown, the way the light fell on your hair. But time refused to take those things. Every battle, every city, every noise of war, still, I saw you there." She looked away. "Memory can be cruel, Your Grace. It keeps alive what should have been allowed to fade. And yet without it," he said, "we would have no proof that love once existed." Quote. The simplicity of his tone pierced her more deeply than any declaration. "You speak as though love were still alive." His eyes softened. "Tell me, Helena, did yours die so easily?" The question hung between them, intimate and perilous. She felt the heat rise in her face and turned toward the window, watching the flakes of snow drift against the glass. "I do not know what you expect me to say," she murmured. "The world changed, and I changed with it." Quote, "But your eyes have not changed," he said. "They still hold truth, even when your words will not." She gave a small, uncertain laugh. "You see ghosts where others see age." "I see the woman I once lost," he replied quietly, "and the one I wish to know again." The words silenced her. For a moment, only the music from the ballroom reached them, a slow waltz, tender and deliberate. He extended his hand. "Dance with me once more, not for the crowd, but for ourselves." She hesitated. The others will talk. They always do. Let them speak of what they cannot understand. Her heart beat painfully as she placed her hand in his. They stepped into the adjoining gallery, where only a few guests lingered in quiet conversation. The music drifted faintly through the open doors. He drew her into the rhythm, their movements gentle and unhurried. This was not the formal waltz of society, but something smaller, closer, an echo of all that had been left unsaid. Helena felt the years between them collapse like a bridge rebuilt plank by plank. For the first time, she allowed herself to meet his gaze without fear. In his eyes, she saw not accusation, but remembrance, and in that remembrance, a forgiveness she had never asked for, but always needed. 10 years, she whispered. Do you not think it too long to begin again? For the right beginning, he said. No time is too long. Her throat tightened. She wanted to speak, to tell him how she had kept the ring he left behind, how she had never let another man hold her hand in the same way. But words would have shattered the fragile peace that surrounded them. When the waltz ended, he did not release her hand immediately. There are things I wish I could undo, he said. But regret, like love, is loyal. It stays until forgiven. She withdrew her hand gently. And have you forgiven me? He smiled faintly. I think I began to, the moment you said yes tonight. She looked at him in confusion. Yes? Yes to this dance. A quiet laugh escaped her. Then you have set yourself an easy task. On the contrary, he said, you have never made anything easy. He bowed slightly, and before she could answer, a servant approached with a discreet cough. Your Grace, Lord Pembroke asks to speak with you regarding tomorrow's session. Thomas inclined his head. Duty calls, as always. Clote. Then I will not keep you, she said softly. He looked at her one last time, his gaze steady. You have never kept me, Helena, only my heart. She watched him go, her pulse unsteady. When he disappeared into the crowd, she turned toward the window again. Outside, the city glowed with candlelight, reflected in puddles of melted snow. It seemed that London itself held its breath. A voice startled her from behind. Lady Helena, is it true? She turned to find the colonel's wife from earlier, her face alight with curiosity. True? Helena asked. That his Grace once proposed to you before the war. It is all the talk of the night. Helena felt her composure tighten. Society remembers more than it ought. The woman smiled knowingly. They say he has not looked at another woman since. Then society indulges in poetry, Helena said calmly. But when she returned to her carriage that evening, she could not banish the thought. The idea that he had carried her memory through all those years was both a balm and a burden. As the wheels rolled through the sleeping streets, Helena pressed her gloved hand to the window and whispered to the darkness, If love waits, may it forgive the years it lost. The morning after the ball dawned pale and still. A soft mist clung to the rooftops of London, dulling the shine of the carriages that rattled down Grosvenor Square. Helena had not slept. The music of the previous night lingered in her ears like a fading echo, and every thought returned to the look in Thomas's eyes as they danced. Mrs. Harcourt, blissfully unaware of the quiet storm within her niece, declared the evening a triumph. She spoke of gowns, titles, and the impression Helena had made upon society, though Helena herself barely heard a word. Her thoughts were elsewhere, on the rose beneath glass, on the warmth of his hand, and on the question that still hung unanswered between them. Why had she refused him? That afternoon, as her aunt napped by the fire, a card was delivered. The handwriting upon it was unmistakable. Lady Helena, if you can spare half an hour, I beg the honour of a visit. There is much that should have been said 10 years ago. My carriage shall wait at 3, Ravensfield. Helena's first impulse was to decline. She feared what might come of such honesty, but silence, she realized, had already stolen 10 years. She sent her reply before she could change her mind. The Ravensfield townhouse on St. James's Street was everything her modest life had forgotten. Marble floors, gilt mirrors, the quiet dignity of wealth used without vanity. A servant led her through the hall to a study overlooking the square. Thomas stood by the window, the faint light outlining the strong lines of his face. He turned as she entered. Lady Helena, Your Grace. For a moment formality hung between them like armour. Then he gestured toward a chair near the fire. Please sit. She did, clasping her gloved hands tightly in her lap. He remained standing. I owe you an apology, he said. I did not mean to speak as I did last night. The past has a way of loosening a man's restraint. There is nothing to forgive, she replied. We are both older now. The years have made us honest. He smiled faintly. Then let us be honest still. I came here to ask a question I should have asked long ago, not as a duke, not even as the man you once knew, but simply as someone who has never found peace in not knowing. Why did you refuse me? She looked into the fire, the flames reflected in her eyes. I have carried that answer with me for 10 years, she said slowly. Perhaps I feared it would sound too small after so long. Truth does not lose weight with time, he said. It merely becomes harder to speak. Her voice was low, steady. When you asked me to marry you, my father had already lost most of his fortune. His debts were deep, his pride deeper still. He forbade me to accept you. He said that love without wealth was ruin, and that ruin was worse than lovelessness. I tried to reason with him. He threatened to disinherit me. He said my choice would destroy my family. Thomas's expression did not change, but his eyes darkened. So it was his command, not your will. It was both, she said. I was his daughter. My mother was ill. My sisters already married into families who would have turned from us if scandal came. I believed my duty was to protect them. He turned away, his voice low. And in protecting them you condemned us. No. I know, she whispered. Every day since I have known. The silence that followed was unbearable. Helena rose, unable to remain still. You think I should have defied him. Perhaps I should have, but I was raised to obey. I was raised to believe that love is a luxury and duty a virtue. And what do you believe now? She met his gaze. Now I believe obedience without heart is nothing but cowardice. Her confession hung in the air, raw and unguarded. Thomas took a step toward her, then stopped. You need not punish yourself for what cannot be changed. I do not seek forgiveness, she said. I only wish you to know that I never stopped loving you. Even when I thought you were gone, I kept the ring you left. I told myself it meant nothing, yet I could never bear to part with it. His composure faltered. You kept it? She nodded. It is the only thing of yours I ever possessed. He exhaled slowly, as if releasing years of restraint. And I, he said quietly, kept the rose. They stood there, divided by a space that felt too wide and yet too narrow. The air seemed to tremble with words unspoken. Finally, he said, if I had known, I might have forgiven you sooner. Would forgiveness have brought you back? She asked. He hesitated. No, war would still have claimed its years, but perhaps it would have spared us this distance. A knock came at the door. The butler entered, murmuring a few words about an urgent message from Parliament. Thomas nodded, his expression closing once more into composure. I must go, he said. Duty calls at inconvenient times. Helena tried to smile. It always has. He paused at the doorway. You have given me truth at last. I did not expect it to hurt so much. Truth always hurts when it matters, she said. He bowed slightly. Then I thank you for wounding me honestly. Quote. When he was gone, Helena stood for a long while before the fire, the warmth reaching her hands but not her heart. She felt neither relief nor peace, only the strange ache of having finally spoken what silence had guarded for too long. Outside, the bells of St. James's tolled the hour. She stepped to the window and watched the grey clouds move over the rooftops. The carriages below seemed to hurry toward lives less complicated than hers. In that moment, Helena understood that truth, once spoken, is never finished. It only waits for the courage to be lived. London society, like the tide, rises with excitement and retreats only to return stronger. Within a week of Helena's visit to the Duke of Ravensfield, whispers began to move through drawing rooms and tea rooms alike. It was said that the Duke had been seen walking with the Greystone Spinster through the gardens of St. James's Square, that he had once proposed to her before the war, that he had never forgotten her. What began as curiosity soon turned into speculation, and speculation into gossip. Helena heard none of it directly at first, but she felt its shadow. Servants grew overly polite. Acquaintances greeted her with too much warmth, too much pity. She knew the signs. Society never forgave a woman who became interesting too late. Mrs. Harcourt, delighted by the attention, saw no danger in it. They speak of you, my dear, because they envy you, she said cheerfully. You are the subject of every conversation. The Duke has revived our good name. Helena smiled faintly. The last time London spoke of me, it called me a disappointment. Then let them revise their opinion, her aunt replied. It will make excellent reading for their breakfast. But gossip, like illness, spreads fastest when ignored. The whispers grew until even those who once pitied Helena began to sneer. Some said she had schemed to regain the Duke's affection, that her modesty was only artifice. Others whispered that he sought her out merely from duty to a forgotten promise. The truth mattered little. It never had. One morning, as Helena sat by the window reading, a footman delivered an envelope bearing Thomas's crest. Inside was a single line, written in his hand. "If the city has turned its eyes upon you, then face them with me. Do not hide." Ah, she read the words again and again. The simplicity of them was both comfort and command. That evening, the butler announced another visitor. The Duke of Ravensfield entered, his expression calm but the tension in his shoulders betraying what restraint could not. "You have heard the talk," she said quietly. "I have," he replied, "and I am here because I will not have your name dragged through every parlour in London." Helena closed the book in her lap. "You cannot silence them, Thomas. They will say what they please, as they always have." "Then let them speak," he said, his tone firm. "But they shall not speak without witness. Tomorrow evening, Lady Locksley holds her reception. You will attend with me. With you? As my companion. Let them see what they choose to whisper about." She stared at him. "You ask me to court scandal. I ask you to stand beside me," he said simply. "You face 10 years of silence. Can you not face 10 days of whispers?" The quiet conviction in his voice left her no room for refusal. "If you wish it, I will go," she said. "I do not wish it for myself," he replied. "I wish it for you." The next evening arrived cold and clear, the air scented faintly with snow. Helena dressed in her finest gown, an elegant creation of pale silver silk, modest but radiant in the candlelight. Her aunt fussed over every ribbon, until at last she sighed with satisfaction. "You look every inch a duchess, my dear." Helena smiled sadly. "I am nothing of the sort." "Not yet," her aunt said, eyes twinkling. When the Ravensfield carriage arrived, Helena's heart trembled at the sight of him waiting at the door. He offered his arm without a word, and she took it. At Lady Locksley's townhouse, the crowd glittered with the wealth and vanity of London. Music floated through the air, laughter rang beneath the chandeliers, and eyes turned as the Duke and Lady Helena entered together. It was a scene of practiced grandeur, yet within moments Helena felt the invisible net of attention draw tight around her. Conversations hushed, fans fluttered, and every glance seemed to measure her worth. Thomas led her through the throng with calm composure, his expression a shield against curiosity. When he paused to greet acquaintances, his hand remained lightly upon hers, a small gesture but one that spoke more loudly than words. Lady Locksley approached with a smile both warm and shrewd. "Your Grace, London has missed you, and Lady Helena, how enchanting to see you again after so many years." "It has been long indeed," Helena said politely. The lady's eyes glimmered. 10 years, if memory serves. I recall the announcement that never came." Thomas's tone was quiet, but edged with steel. "Then I am pleased to give society another chance to speculate. It seems it has waited long enough." The woman laughed lightly, uncertain whether to be flattered or chastened. "You have not lost your wit, Your Grace." "Nor my patience," he said, and moved on. Later, when the orchestra began a waltz, Thomas turned to Helena. "Will you dance?" She hesitated. "After such an entrance?" "Precisely after such an entrance," he said. "Let them see what loyalty looks like." And so they danced, slowly, deliberately, as if the years between them had been only a pause. The crowd parted, whispers rippled like wind through tall grass. Yet in the center of that storm, Helena felt peace. She no longer saw the eyes watching or the envy curling at the edges of admiration. She saw only him, the man who had once been denied her, who now stood beside her without shame. When the music ended, applause filled the room. Thomas bowed to her, his gaze steady, his voice low enough for her alone. "Let that be the last word they speak tonight." The next morning, the papers carried polite praise of the event. The Duke of Ravensfield, it said, had restored grace and dignity to a friendship long misrepresented. Society, fickle as ever, turned its appetite to fresher rumors. Helena read the notice with quiet relief. "You have silenced them," she said when Thomas called that afternoon. "Not silenced," he replied. "Only reminded them that truth does not need defense when it stands upright." She smiled. "And what of me? Must I always stand so upright?" His eyes softened. "You may lean if you choose, but only on me." She looked away, a faint warmth rising in her cheeks. "You have become far too sure of yourself." "Only because I have nothing left to doubt," he said. And though she laughed, there was a tenderness in the sound that neither mistook. Outside, the bells of London chimed the hour. The world, for once, seemed content to let them breathe. The weeks that followed Lady Locksley's ball brought a calm that felt almost fragile. The whispers that had once filled the drawing rooms of London began to fade, replaced by new scandals and fresher names. Yet for Helena, quiet did not mean peace. The stillness carried an ache she could not name, a longing that deepened each time she thought of Thomas. He visited often now, under the pretext of discussing charitable works or estate matters, yet each meeting drifted toward more personal ground. His manner had softened. The sharpness of old wounds seemed dulled by something gentler, something that might have been hope. One evening, as winter began to loosen its hold, he called again. "I will return to Ravensfield for a time," he said. "There is business that cannot wait." "I wish you safe travels," Helena replied, keeping her voice composed. He looked at her steadily. "I would have you come as well. My mother's gardens are beginning to wake. You once said that spring was your favorite season." She hesitated. "Wiltshire is far from London." "It is nearer than 10 years, he said quietly. She could not answer. He bowed and left, without another word. Days later, another letter came formal, elegant, offering escort and lodging for her and Mrs. Harcourt at Ravensfield. Her aunt, ever delighted by adventure, accepted before Helena could protest. "Fresh air in society," Mrs. Harcourt declared. "It will do you both good." And so it was settled. The journey to Ravensfield was long but pleasant. When the carriage turned onto the wide avenue lined with elm trees, Helena caught her breath. The great house stood bathed in the pale light of early spring, its windows glinting like calm water. The sight stirred a memory of youth, a time when she had believed happiness could be planted and tended like roses. Thomas awaited them at the steps, his expression one of composed welcome. "Ravensfield is honoured," he said, as he helped them alight. Mrs. Harcourt, impressed beyond speech, busied herself admiring the architecture, leaving the two alone for a moment. "You see," he said softly to Helena, "it was not so far after all." "No," she admitted, "only a lifetime." Lactuwa. Over the next days, she explored the estate, reacquainting herself with the countryside she had once loved. The air smelled of rain and new grass. Servants greeted her kindly, aware perhaps that their master's gaze followed her more often than custom required. On the third evening, after dinner, she found herself walking through the gardens alone. The sun had dipped low, leaving the sky brushed with silver. Along the path, the first blossoms of early roses trembled in the breeze. She turned a corner and saw Thomas standing by the lake, his reflection dark against the fading light. He heard her approach and smiled. "You always preferred the quiet parts of a garden. They are honest," she said. "They do not pretend to be what they are not." He laughed softly. "Then I should envy them." She shook her head. "You have no cause to envy anything." "Do I not?" he said. "I envy the years you lived without me." Her breath caught. "Those years were not kind, calm. Nor were mine," he replied. "But they taught me patience, and perhaps patience was the lesson we both needed." They stood side by side, the scent of damp earth around them, the faint song of evening birds overhead. For a long while neither spoke. Then she said, almost to herself, "I am not the woman I was, Thomas. Time has changed me." He turned to her, his voice quiet but firm. "And I am no longer the man you left. Yet somehow, the space between us feels smaller than ever." Quote, "Because we have learned regret? Because we have learned truth." She looked down at her gloved hands. "I fear truth may come too late." He stepped closer. "Nothing worth having ever arrives too early." Her eyes lifted to meet his. The air seemed to still. She felt his nearness, the faint warmth of him, the way his gaze held not demand but understanding. "I do not ask you to forget the past," he said, "only to stop living inside it." Tears blurred her vision. "You speak as if it were easy." "It is not," he said softly, "but I would share its weight, if you will let me." The words broke something in her, some wall built of duty and pride. She reached for him, her voice trembling. "I have spent 10 years regretting a single decision. I will not regret another." He took her hand. The evening wind lifted the edge of her shawl, carrying the scent of rain. "Then let regret come," he murmured, "but let it come after love." Gout. It was not a grand gesture, not a moment meant for witnesses. He bent his head and kissed her lightly, reverently, as though afraid to startle the very air. It was a promise without words, a forgiveness without condition. When they parted, she found she was trembling, though not from fear. "What will the world say?" she whispered. "Let it say what it always does," he answered. "It will tire of us soon enough." The faint sound of footsteps broke the spell. Mrs. Harcourt appeared on the path, calling cheerfully for her niece to admire the moonlight. Helena turned away quickly, composing herself. Thomas smiled with quiet amusement. "Tomorrow," he said, "I shall show you the new rose garden. It is not as lovely as the one at Greystone, but it is learning. And you? She asked softly. Have you learned? He looked at her, his eyes gentle. I am trying. Isaac seen? That night, as she lay in the room prepared for her, the sound of the wind through the trees lulled her to restless dreams. In them, she was neither young nor old, only a woman standing once more by a lake, her heart finally willing to listen. When morning came, the first light of spring touched the windows, and Helena knew that something had changed. Not the world outside, but the world within her. The following days at Ravensfield unfolded with a quiet sweetness that neither Helena nor Thomas had dared to imagine. Spring crept softly over the hills, the gardens filled with the scent of new blossoms, and sunlight lingered longer each afternoon. Within the great house the air seemed warmer, the corridors less solemn. Servants moved with discreet smiles, aware that something tender had settled between their master and his guest. Helena felt it too, the strange peace that comes when fear begins to fade. Yet peace, she knew, was never without its price. For all the gentleness Thomas showed her, there was a restlessness in him that surfaced when he thought she was not looking. He carried the burden of his position as others might carry armor necessary, heavy, and sometimes cold. One morning, she found him in the library, standing before the tall windows that overlooked the Rose Terrace. Papers were scattered across the desk, letters sealed in red wax, reports from his steward, and notes in his own hand. He looked up when she entered, his expression softening instantly. You are early, he said. The morning is too lovely for sleep, she replied. I thought you might walk with me. I wish I could, he said, glancing at the letters. But Ravensfield is not kind to its masters when spring arrives. There are accounts to settle, tenants to visit, and correspondence that multiplies faster than weeds. She smiled faintly. Even dukes must obey their duties, even when they wish to forget them, he murmured. She stepped closer, resting her hand lightly upon the back of his chair. Do you ever regret it? Regret Ravensfield? No. Regret what it made you give up. He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, Sometimes I think power is only another kind of captivity. It buys respect, but it demands solitude. She studied him quietly. Then why not choose freedom? He turned toward her, his eyes shadowed. Because freedom has its cost, Helena, and sometimes it costs another person's peace. Before she could ask what he meant, the door opened. The butler entered, his expression hesitant. Your Grace, Lord Pembroke has arrived. He insists upon seeing you. Thomas's mouth tightened. Of course he does. Show him to the study. Ozo. When the man had gone, Helena asked gently, Who is Lord Pembroke? My cousin, he said, his tone cool. And my heir, should I never marry. I see, she murmured. You will not find him agreeable, he added. But he speaks for much of the family. They believe I owe it to the title to marry soon and suitably. Suitably, she repeated, meaning wealth and youth. And lineage, he said dryly. Qualities that matter more to them than kindness. She smiled faintly. Then they have not changed. No, he said, but I have. She hesitated. Will they oppose you? He met her gaze steadily. They already do. Later that afternoon, she heard raised voices from the study. Though she tried not to listen, the words carried through the half-open door. The Greystone woman? A spinster past her bloom, with no fortune and no connections worth the ink to write them. She is more than that, Thomas's voice answered, calm but cutting. You cannot be serious, the cousin retorted. It is madness. The name Ravensfield demands a match that strengthens it, not weakens it. The name Ravensfield, Thomas replied, was built by men who forgot that a title means nothing without honor. There was the sound of movement, the scrape of a chair. Then Pembroke's voice again, sharper. Marry her, and you will make yourself a subject of ridicule. Society forgives a duke many things, but not sentiment. Quote, I have endured ridicule before, Thomas said. It did not kill me then. It will not now. You will destroy the family, the cousin hissed. I will save it from itself, came the quiet reply. The door closed with force. Moments later, Thomas emerged, his face pale but resolute. He stopped short when he saw Helena in the corridor. You heard, he said. Only enough to know that I am the cause of trouble. He shook his head. You are the cause of nothing but honesty. Quate. Honesty is rarely admired, she said softly. It will be, when the truth is too loud to ignore. He reached for her hand, but she stepped back. Thomas, I cannot let you risk everything for me, he frowned. Do you think my title matters more than my word? I think your world will not forgive you, she said, and I would not be the reason it turns against you. You underestimate me. he said gently. And you underestimate yourself. Perhaps, she whispered, but I have seen what society does to women who forget their place. He looked at her for a long moment, then said quietly, and I have seen what it does to men who forget their hearts. The tension between them hung heavy, neither anger nor surrender, only the ache of two people caught between duty and desire. That evening, the household was subdued. Lord Pembroke departed in silence, his carriage vanishing down the drive like a shadow retreating with the light. Thomas dined privately, claiming fatigue. Helena took her meal with Mrs. Harcourt, who spoke cheerfully of the gardens while Helena's mind wandered elsewhere. Later, unable to sleep, she walked once more through the halls. A single candle flickered in the study. She paused at the doorway. Thomas sat alone, his head bowed over an unopened letter. The sight of him, so strong in the eyes of the world, so weary in solitude, struck her heart. She wanted to go to him, to offer comfort, but something held her still. Instead, she whispered into the quiet, "Please, do not lose yourself for me." He looked up, as if he had heard, though she had not spoken aloud. Their eyes met across the dim room, then she turned and walked away. In that moment, she knew his struggle was not with her, but with the life that bound them both. The dilemma was not whether he loved her, it was whether love could survive the weight of a title. Spring had ripened into early summer at Ravensfield. The air was fragrant with lilac and rose, and the lake shimmered beneath the morning Sunday. Yet beneath the beauty of the season, tension wound itself through the house like an unseen thread. Lord Pembroke's departure had not silenced the discontent he carried with him. It had merely given it distance from which to grow. Rumours began to stir. Letters arrived from London, written in careful tones that concealed curiosity behind courtesy. Old acquaintances who had once ignored the Duke now sought his company again, eager to confirm the gossip for themselves. Invitations came thinly veiled tests of loyalty, and among them one stood out, a grand summer gathering at Ravensfield itself, proposed by Lady Pembroke, who had written with exaggerated warmth. Thomas read the letter at breakfast, his jaw tightening. "It seems my family wishes to reconcile," he said dryly, "at my expense." Quote, Helena, seated across from him, lowered her teacup. "Will you accept?" "I must," he said. "To refuse would be to confirm every rumour." "And to accept?" He met her gaze. "To face them. I would rather meet contempt than cowardice." Mrs. Harcourt clapped her hands in delight, oblivious to the undertone. A gathering at Ravensfield. How splendid. It will put an end to all this unpleasant talk. Helena said nothing. She had lived long enough to know that society seldom tired of unpleasant talk, it only changed its subject. The day of the event arrived beneath a sky of flawless blue. Carriages lined the drive, the house filled with laughter and the rustle of silks. The guests were courteous but watchful, greeting Helena with smiles that concealed judgment. She bore it with quiet dignity, her composure unbroken even as whispers brushed against her like the flick of unseen wings. Thomas moved among his guests with practiced grace, his manner calm but guarded. When his eyes met hers across the room, the faintest nod passed between them, an unspoken promise that she was not alone. Lady Pembroke, a woman of poised cruelty, made her entrance near midday. She swept through the hall in a gown of emerald satin, her voice smooth as honey. "Your Grace," she said to Thomas, "how lovely it is to see Ravensfield so lively again, and how kind of you to invite everyone, Lizzie." Her glance slid toward Helena, her smile sweet and sharp. "Lady Pembroke," Thomas said evenly, "you are always welcome here." "How generous of you," she replied. "It is a rare man who can bear to entertain his former admirers and his current." She paused delicately. "Friends." The silence that followed was swift and merciless. Helena felt the sting of 100 eyes upon her. Thomas's expression did not change, but the muscle in his jaw tightened. "I would caution you, madam," he said softly, "against finishing that thought. Words once spoken have a way of finding their mark." Lady Pembroke laughed lightly. "Oh, Your Grace, I meant no harm. Society merely delights in its little stories. And you have always been a fine storyteller," he said. The moment passed, but its shadow lingered. Helena excused herself soon after, retreating to the garden where the noise of the crowd faded into the hum of bees and the rustle of leaves. She stood beneath the great elm by the lake, trying to steady her breath. How foolish she had been to think peace could last. The world she had once escaped had found her again, dressed in silk and polite cruelty. She closed her eyes, listening to the water lap against the stones. Footsteps approached. "Helena." She turned. Thomas stood behind her, his expression grave. "You should not have left the hall," he said gently. "They will say you fled." "Then let them," she answered. "I will not play their games." He stepped closer. "Nor will I." "You cannot fight them," she said. "Their weapons are whispers, and they never miss." "Then I shall give them something louder to speak of." Before she could ask what he meant, he took her hand. His voice was steady, but his eyes burned with quiet fire. "I have had enough of shadows. Let them see the truth with their own eyes." He drew her back toward the terrace where the guests still lingered. The orchestra had begun to play, the strains of a waltz floating through the air. Conversation hushed as they entered. Lady Pembroke's smile froze. Thomas released Helena's hand only long enough to address the crowd. "My friends," he said, his tone measured, carrying easily through the hall, "you have been kind to humor my household today, and I thank you for it. But before this gathering continues, there is one matter I would set straight." Every head turned toward him. Helena stood still, her heart pounding. "Some of you may remember," he went on, "that 10 years ago I asked Lady Helena Greystone to be my wife. Circumstances, as you know, prevented it. Yet what time once divided, it has now restored. I ask her again here, before you all, to do me the honor she once denied." A gasp swept through the room. Lady Pembroke paled, her fan trembling in her hand. Helena stared at him, unable to speak. Thomas turned to her, his eyes unwavering. "Helena, I waited 10 years for your yes. I will wait 10 more if I must, but I will wait no longer in silence." The hall was utterly still. Then slowly, Helena found her voice. "You would risk everything again for me?" He smiled faintly. "Everything worth having is risk." She stepped toward him, her eyes glistening. "Then yes," she said softly. "Yes, Thomas." Applause began hesitantly, then spread like the breaking of a tide. The orchestra swelled into music once more. Lady Pembroke turned away, her face stiff with defeat. "So the scandal ends with a wedding," she murmured. Thomas drew Helena's hand to his lips. "No," he whispered for her alone. "It ends with truth." Later, when the guests had departed and the house was quiet, Helena walked once more through the garden. The moonlight shimmered across the lake, and the air was cool with the scent of roses. Behind her, Thomas approached, his steps soft upon the gravel. "Do you regret it?" he asked. She turned to him, smiling through her tears. "Only that I waited so long to say yes." He took her hand. "Then let this be our beginning." The garden was silent except for the wind moving through the trees, carrying away the last echoes of scandal and leaving behind only the steady heartbeat of forgiveness. The house at Ravensfield had not known such quiet since the morning before the gathering. The echo of music and applause had faded, leaving behind only the rustle of spring wind through the gardens and the distant murmur of servants. For Helena, the stillness felt unreal, as if the world itself held its breath after what had been spoken. She had not seen Thomas since the night before. He had walked her to her room after the crowd dispersed, his hand steady on hers, his voice calm. Yet there had been a gentleness in his eyes that words could not reach. "Rest," he had said. "Tomorrow will come soon enough." Now morning had come, clear and bright. The household moved with quiet excitement. Flowers were being arranged, the great dining hall prepared for a private dinner that evening. Mrs. Harcourt, radiant with delight, whispered to the housekeeper that she had known from the beginning this would happen. Helena, unable to bear the attention, slipped out into the garden. The air was cool and sweet. The rose bushes glowed with dew. The sky, soft as porcelain, stretched endlessly above. She walked slowly down the path toward the lake where so many of their conversations had begun. Thomas was there, standing by the water's edge. He turned when he heard her step upon the gravel. "You rise early," he said. "I could not sleep," she answered. "Nor I." They stood a moment in silence. The lake mirrored the sky, calm and pale. A single swan drifted across it, unhurried and graceful. Helena drew her shawl closer. "It still feels like a dream," she said softly. "What you did yesterday, the things you said." "They were long overdue," he replied. "You spoke before the entire county," she said with a faint smile. "And yet I remember only the sound of your voice." He looked at her then, his eyes filled with warmth. "I wanted the world to know what it had forgotten, that love, once true, does not fade because time commands it." Her gaze fell to the ground. "And yet, the world may not forgive us so easily." "Then let it learn forgiveness from us," he said. "We owe it nothing, Helena. Not our happiness, not our fear." She lifted her eyes to him. "You make everything sound so simple." "Only because I have already lived through the complicated parts." He extended his hand. "Walk with me." They followed the curve of the garden, where the first roses of summer had begun to open. The air carried the faint hum of bees and the distant sound of the fountain near the terrace. "When I left England," Thomas said after a while, "I thought I could forget. I told myself that war and duty would fill the space you left, but every road I traveled led back to you." Helena smiled sadly. "And every road I walked led nowhere at all." He stopped beside the old elm tree, the one that overlooked the lake. "Do you remember this place?" "How could I not?" she said. "It was here you first asked me to be your wife." He nodded. "And here I lost you. I thought it right to begin again where everything ended." From his coat pocket, he drew a small velvet box. Time had faded its color, but the clasp shone still. When he opened it, the same simple gold ring lay within the one she had kept for 10 years, the one she had never returned. "I sent this to you once," he said quietly. "It found its way back to me after my father's death. I think it waited for the right hour." Her throat tightened. "You kept it." "I could not let it go any more than I could let you," he said. "So I ask you again, Helena Greystone, here beneath the same sky that heard my first mistake, will you be my wife?" Tears welled in her eyes. She reached out, her voice barely a whisper, "And this time I will not say no." He smiled, the kind of smile that belongs only to those who have learned the cost of waiting. He slipped the ring onto her finger. "Then it is done," he said softly. "No music, no audience, only truth." She looked down at the ring, the gold glinting in the sunlight. "It feels as though it was meant to be here all along." "It was," he replied. "We were simply slow in finding the moment." They stood together in silence, the breeze lifting the edges of her shawl. The lake glittered like glass. The scent of roses drifted around them. For the first time, neither felt the weight of the years between them. Helena turned to him. "You once said that power is captivity. Does that still hold true?" He considered this. "Perhaps," he said, "but love makes captivity a choice, not a sentence." She smiled through her tears. "Then I will choose it." He touched her cheek gently. "And I will spend the rest of my life deserving that choice." They began to walk back toward the house, side by side. In the distance, Mrs. Harcourt waved from the terrace, calling their names with unrestrained joy. Helena laughed softly. "My aunt will plan a celebration before we even return." Thomas chuckled. "Then let her. For once, she may be right." When they reached the steps, he paused, turning to look back at the garden. The sunlight fell across the path where they had stood. "It is strange," he said quietly. "All these years I thought I wanted to forget this place, but now I think it was waiting for us to return." Helena looked at him tenderly. "Perhaps love never leaves. It only waits to be called by its name again." He took her hand, pressing it to his lips. "Then let this place bear witness that we have spoken it truly." Inside the house, the bells began to ring for midday. Servants paused, smiling as they passed the news along the corridors. The Duke of Ravensfield was to marry Lady Helena Greystone at summer's end, and somewhere beyond the open windows, the swan upon the lake lifted its wings and glided into the sunlight, as though carrying their promise toward the bright horizon that awaited. A year had passed since that morning in the garden when Helena had said yes at last. The seasons had turned gently over Ravensfield, each one leaving behind its quiet blessings. The lake, once a mirror of solitude, now reflected the laughter of children from the nearby village who came to gather flowers for the chapel. The great house itself seemed softened, its windows alive with light, its halls filled with warmth instead of echo. The Duke and Duchess of Ravensfield had settled into a life of unhurried grace. Helena, though never fond of grandeur, found peace in the rhythm of the estate. She tended the school for the tenants' children, managed the infirmary her husband had built in the village, and filled the manor with music and calm. The servants loved her, not because of her title, but because she remembered every name, every sorrow, every joy. On a morning in early summer, she stood upon the terrace overlooking the gardens. The roses, heavy with bloom, spilled their scent into the air. Beside her, Thomas read from a letter, his brow furrowed in mild concentration. "Another request from Parliament," he said, folding it neatly. "They wish for my opinion on a matter of trade. I suspect they mean to disagree with it before I give it." Helena smiled. "Then you must give it kindly, so they will have to be polite in refusing." He laughed softly. "You have turned diplomacy into an art. I have merely learned from you," she said. He set the letter aside and looked at her. "From me you have learned patience, perhaps. I am still learning courage from you." Quote. She touched his hand lightly. "And what will we do with so much patience and courage between us?" He pretended to think. "We might build another garden. You would only fill it with roses. They remind me of you." She laughed softly, and the sound drifted out over the terrace, mingling with the hum of bees. Later that afternoon, they walked to the lake. The sunlight shimmered upon the water, and the swan, perhaps the same one, or perhaps its descendant, drifted near the reeds. Helena paused, her hand resting on his arm. "Do you remember," she said, "when we stood here last year? I thought the world was holding its breath." "It was," he said, "waiting for you to say yes." She smiled. "It seems I took my time." 10 years and 1 yes, he murmured. "A fair exchange, I think." They walked in silence for a while, their steps slow, unhurried. The peace between them was not the fragile stillness of the past, but something deeper, the peace of those who have endured and still chosen to love. When they reached the old elm tree, Helena stopped. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, "what might have happened if I had said yes the first time?" He looked at her thoughtfully. "I used to, but I think we would not have understood what we were promising. Love given too easily may be beautiful, but love earned through years becomes unbreakable." "Cos." She nodded. "Then perhaps time was kind after all." He smiled. "Time was patient, and so were we." They stood together beneath the elm, the same tree that had watched their youth, their sorrow, and their return. The breeze lifted the hem of her gown and carried the scent of roses through the air. Inside the house, Mrs. Harcourt was dictating a letter to her distant relatives, full of lively descriptions of the estate and her conviction that her niece had at last achieved perfect happiness. "It only took a decade," she said to the butler, "but some things are worth the wait." As evening settled, the household gathered for supper. The long table was simple, adorned with candles and fresh flowers. The tenants' children sang softly in the corridor, their voices pure and clear. Thomas rose, lifting his glass. "To time," he said, "to what it takes and what it gives." Helena lifted hers in reply. "And to love," she said, "to its quiet courage." Claude. The glasses touched, and the sound was like a bell, soft, certain, eternal. Later, when the stars had appeared and the house grew still, Helena stood at the window of her chamber, looking out across the darkened gardens. The moonlight lay upon the lake like a silver path. Somewhere beyond it, an owl called softly, and the night answered. Thomas entered quietly, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "You should rest," he said. "Tomorrow will be long." "What awaits us tomorrow?" she asked. "Only more of this," he said. "Days that come gently and end the same way." She leaned her head against him. "Then let tomorrow come." He kissed her forehead. "It will, my love. It always does." For a while they stood in silence, the kind of silence that speaks more than words. The world outside seemed to sleep, yet within the walls of Ravensfield, life continued steady, tender, real. And when Helena closed her eyes, she did not dream of regret or lost years. She dreamed only of the garden in spring, of a man who had waited with patience greater than time itself, and of a single word that had changed everything. Yes.